Welcome to HeadLocke, the official podcast of the John Locke Foundation. I'm Mitch Kokine. Suppose you have the idea of buying a home near the North Carolina coast, using it for part of the year, then renting it out to vacationers to help pay the bills. Well, if those plans involve the city of Wilmington, you could face problems. Our guest in this episode is here to tell us about a lawsuit challenging a new ordinance in Wilmington. It places new restrictions on vacation rentals. Adam Griffin is Constitutional Law Fellow at the Institute for Justice. Adam, welcome to HeadLocke.
Thank you so much for having me today, Mr. Kakai. Really appreciate being here to talk about this important case.
So we're going to get into the particular case, but first of all, tell us what it is that Wilmington has changed in its rules that affect people who would like to rent out structures for vacationers.
So the city of Wilmington has passed a new ordinance in the last year that forces property owners to obtain a permit if they want to rent their property. Prior to the ordinance's enactment, it was perfectly legal to engage in vacation rentals in the city of Wilmington. You didn't need permission from the government to rent your property. After the ordinance was passed, they're now requiring a permit to rent. And to enforce that permit, they have imposed cap and separation requirements to limit the amount of people who are allowed to have a permit. So it's not just a simple fill out a form and get a permit to rent. They've limited to an exclusive group of people that are allowed to rent their property for a short term. And they've done that by saying only 2% of properties in the beach town of Wilmington can engage in vacation rentals. And if one property is renting to vacation rentals has this permit, no other property within 400 feet of that property is allowed to vacation rent. So they've really constricted the property rights in the city of Wilmington and limited to a small group the amount of people that are allowed to vacation rent.
And this has had a direct impact on the clients that the Institute for Justice is working with. Tell us about the circumstances of your clients.
That's exactly right. So David and Peggy Schroeder are a retired couple. They raised their family in Wilmington. They were residents of Wilmington for 30 years, and they recently retired to the North Carolina mountains. But in order to stay connected to their family, they bought a townhome in Wilmington, and they were going to live there as a second home, and they were also going to rent the townhome out. They made substantial investments in the townhome, put a lot of money into the townhome, to rent it, to suit it up for renting. And right as they were ready to rent, they had started renting, the city passed this ordinance. And that's what makes this ordinance particularly bad. It doesn't just enforce newcomers to the city. So it doesn't just enforce prospectively. What this ordinance does is it says, even though you already have a right, even though you've made substantial investments, even though you've already started renting, it then takes that right from you after they've started renting. But the city can't change the rules in the middle of the game and then punish people for following those rules. And that's what happened with the Schroeders. They were just law-abiding citizens who were following the rules, who bought a property that they knew they could vacation rent. And then once they had made substantial investments, the city of Wilmington changed the rules on them and is depriving them of the use of their property as a vacation rental. And that's unconstitutional under the North Carolina Constitution.
Everything I suspect that the Schroeders were doing throughout this process was under the impression that Wilmington is going to operate as it always has, and people will be able to rent out their homes. They had no idea that Wilmington was going to change the rules on them.
No, they didn't. They actually did their due diligence. They researched state law, local law, their HOA rules and regulations. They consulted a realtor and a lawyer who all told them that vacation rentals were legal. They bought in a community where vacation rentals were lawful. But then what happened when the city of Wilmington changed the rules on them? They decided that they would raffle off their property rights. So the city of Wilmington took the Schroeders' use of their property, took everyone's use of their property in the city of Wilmington, and put them into a lottery and raffled off their rights. And because the Schroeders' neighbor was within 400 feet of them and won the lottery, the Schroeders lost their right to rent. And so the city of Wilmington turned their property right into a raffle ticket and gave it away. And that's just not something that the North Carolina Constitution allows them to do.
Now, at first blush, those of us who are interested in property rights hear this and say, this sounds crazy. Obviously, working on this case, you had to have come across what Wilmington says is its justification. How does the city say that this makes sense and that it's constitutional, that they can say only 2% of the properties can rent out to vacationers, and you can't if you have anyone within 400 feet of you?
Well, the city of Wilmington, we don't think that they have constitutional arguments, but their basic argument is that the Constitution and state law doesn't prevent them from zoning. They can do anything they want with zoning. And if that means raffling off people's property rights, if that means capping and limiting the amount of people that can engage in this, if that means taking people's property rights by changing the rules in the middle of the game, then they think that they can do that. And they think that their zoning power is just not limited by the Constitution. And that's why we filed this lawsuit, to demonstrate to the city and that they are in fact bound by the Constitution, and to stand up for the Schroeders and other families who want to keep their property rights and not be arbitrarily deprived of those property rights through a raffle system.
We are chatting with Adam Griffin, who is a constitutional law fellow at the Institute for Justice. What sort of impact has this decision had on the Schroeders? Obviously, enough of a major impact that they're wanting to go to court and are willing to work with the Institute for Justice on this. I imagine this is not just something where you could say, all right, well, now we're going to deal with living in the mountains and forget about being in Wilmington anymore.
It was really devastating for the Schroeders. This was their retirement dream home. This is where they raise their children. This is where their family and friends are. This is where they've spent their entire lives, and they've done a lot in the community to give back to the community. And so it really felt like the city of Wilmington had turned its back on them, that they would change the rules on them in the middle of the game, and they would take away their property rights through a raffle. And the thing with the Schroeders is that, they're hardworking people, and they've saved their money all their lives, and their retirement is in rental property. So they sold 2 other properties to purchase this townhome, and they put a lot of money in substantially renovating it, and they can't afford to keep it if they can't vacation rent it. The only way they can afford to have this home, this second home, is to be able to rent it when they're not using it. And so if they lose this right, if the city is allowed to raffle off their property right, then they are probably going to be forced to sell their townhome and be disconnected from the community that they spent their lives in, and the place where their children and grandchildren and all their friends are. So it has been really challenging for the Schroeders, but they've been tough, and they've stood strong, and they're partnering with the Institute for Justice to show that you can fight City Hall, and that the Constitution was designed to put limits on government and what government can do to infringe your property rights.
What is the ultimate goal of this suit?
We want to establish precedent in North Carolina that a very pernicious idea called amortization has constitutional limits. Amortization is this idea that government can take your property, and rather than pay you for that property, it can force you to pay yourself for their taking. Under the North Carolina Constitution and under the U.S. Constitution, it's well-established law that when the government takes your property, they have to pay you just compensation. But what amortization does is they take the Schroeders' right to rent from them, and then they say, now that we've taken that right, you can rent for 1 more year. So what happened is the Schroeders lost the lottery, and they were allowed, and then they lost the lottery, and the city said, well, you can rent for 1 more year, and then you can work and keep the property up and pay yourself. We're not going to pay you for taking that property right away. We're going to allow you to pay yourself for it. And that's unconstitutional. If the government's going to take your property away, they have to pay you for it. They can't require you to pay for it yourself. And so what amortization really is it's a loophole around eminent domain, and it is a ticking time bomb on the Schroeders' rights. And that's unconstitutional under North Carolina's law of the land clause.
You mentioned eminent domain, and that was one of the thoughts I had, that if these property rights are taken away, in other circumstances, building a public school, building a public road, you take someone's property, you have to pay them for it. In this case, Wilmington is trying to avoid paying the Schroeders or anyone else who wants to be a vacation renter avoid paying them for those rights?
That's right. Amortization is a way in which the government owes you a debt for taking your property, and then it says you pay your own debt. And so it is sort of eminent domain on the cheap.
This case has already had some hearings. Tell us what we should expect in terms of seeing this case now moving through the North Carolina courts.
That's true. So we took over this case in the middle of the case. There's a state law claim. We're arguing that this ordinance violates state law in addition to violating the Constitution, and the constitutional claims have been dismissed. And we are now moving to the trial court, and we're arguing the preemption claim, and we will also be raising the constitutional claims. And so we are hoping that we will get a state trial court in Wilmington to say that the ordinance in Wilmington violates the legislature's state law that prohibits requiring a permit to rent. But regardless, we're going to be arguing also that it violates the North Carolina Constitution, and we hope that a trial court will side with us. And if a trial court does not side with us, then we will take it up on appeal. And it's possible that this is the kind of case that could create appellate precedent that would protect property owners throughout North Carolina. The Institute for Justice is always dedicated and determined to create positive case law and positive precedent that will protect people's property rights throughout the state of North Carolina. And that's what we're aiming to do with this case.
If the Schroeders lose, and of course you're working to ensure that they don't, but if the Schroeders lose, what does this mean in terms of protection of property rights, not just for them, but for other people in Wilmington or in other beach communities or mountain communities with a lot of vacationers who have similar ideas about what to do with property rights?
It is dangerous if the Schroeders lose. It means that property rights are even more in jeopardy, that they're more at the whim of municipalities and cities who think that they can just change the rules in the middle of the game, and that that's perfectly fair, and that they can take people's property and not pay for it and require them to compensate themselves when they take that property, and that they can give rights to small groups of people. In this case, 2% of people with a 400-foot buffer around them have the exclusive right to rent. And so property rights are very much threatened if Wilmington is not held accountable here.
Given IJ's history with other cases of this sort, is there good news? Can you point to other places and say, look, other communities have tried something like this either in North Carolina or other states, and courts have said, no, you can't do this?
Well, so the Institute for Justice has fought for property rights for many years, and we've been successful in a number of instances, especially in curbing eminent domain abuse. After the Kelo decision at the U.S. Supreme Court, some of the listeners may know about the Kelo case, the Institute for Justice launched the Hands Off Your Home campaign. And that campaign, we went through, and in 48 states, we've won greater protections against eminent domain abuse and for property owners than there previously were, making it harder for cities and municipalities and states to take people's property and convert it into an impermissible purpose. So there's a lot of reason for hope that the state courts will be protective of property rights. And North Carolina itself has a long history of protecting property rights, going back to the founding of North Carolina all the way up to today, protecting settled property interests and protecting people's property rights when government tries to change the rules in the middle of the game or when they try to take property without paying for it.
Well, it's a very interesting case. I imagine if people want to learn more, they could go to your website, ij.org, and learn more about the details of this case.
Yes, sir. They can go to the instituteforjustice.org and they can look up NC amortization is the name of the case. It is David and Peggy Schroeder, and they can learn more about the case there, the lawyers, the legal claims, the story of this wonderful retired couple that's standing up for their property rights and for all North Carolinians' property rights.
Adam Griffin is Constitutional Law Fellow at the Institute for Justice, and once again, he and the Institute are working with the Schroeders in Wilmington to help protect property rights. Adam, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kakai. We appreciate you having us on today.